It was a freezing winter day, and I remember stepping out of my car into that gray afternoon. I ended up at this old, abandoned village. I've always been fascinated by places lost in time, full of stories and legends. This place, with its eerie silence and crumbling buildings, was perfect for an adventure. The sky was a mix of fiery colors which clashed with the cold air. The sunset was stunning, gold and crimson blending together. The village, or what was left of it, was mostly shadows now. Long, creepy shadows stretched out everywhere, making it feel like a story was about to unfold. I had read many tales about strange sightings here, stories that sent chills down my spine. But I'm a skeptic at heart, always eager to debunk myths. Still, something about this place intrigued me enough to leave my warm apartment for an evening stroll through this forgotten relic of the past. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel as I wandered around, looking at the old, broken-down buildings. The quiet sounds of nature and a faint whiff of something sulfurous made me think of the old legends. But there was no solid proof of anything out of the ordinary. I zipped my coat tighter as goosebumps rose on my skin and headed toward the big, old mansion that stood out in the village. Walking around, it felt like I had stepped back in time. There were old shackles, ruined houses, and a blacksmith's shop, all becoming harder to see as the light faded. The closer I got to the mansion, the quieter it became. It was an unnatural silence, as if even nature was holding its breath. As I continued my lonely walk, I got an odd feeling. It was like I wasn't alone, like I was being watched. It wasn't a comforting feeling, more like I was an unwelcome guest on sacred grounds. I kept looking around for any signs of life, but there was nothing. Just the eerie emptiness, enveloped in the quickly descending twilight. I tried to shake off the feeling. I'm a rational person, not one to get scared easily. It's just your mind playing tricks, I told myself, though my own voice sounded hollow. I tried to focus on the path ahead, resisting the urge to keep glancing at the woods and the old buildings. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, nothing bizarre. Everything was as normal as it could be in an abandoned village known for spooky tales. Yet, that nagging feeling at the back of my mind wouldn't leave. Just as I decided to head back to the path, I heard the rustle of leaves behind me. It could have been a random movement, maybe a woodland creature. Curiosity got the better of me, and I turned around to investigate. The thought of experiencing something unusual was exciting. I was always on the lookout for something thrilling and unknown. Little did I know, I was about to have the most bizarre encounter of my life. My evening walk was about to take a turn into the unknown. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I had barely turned away from the path when I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature that made me shiver, despite my warm clothes. I could see my breath fogging up in front of me, adding an eerie quality to the fading light. But that wasn't what froze me to the spot. A figure emerged, a terrifying sight that became clearer with each passing second. It had an elongated horse-like face and a scaly body, more reptilian than mammalian. But the most horrifying part was the wings, huge bat-like wings that loomed over me. The silence of the village was shattered by a horrible screech. The creature flew off, scattering leaves and dirt with its wings. I had never seen anything like it, this nightmarish mix of a bat, a lizard, and a horse. My heart pounded as I watched the creature fly over the old mansion. In sheer terror and awe, I took a stumbling step back, tripping over my own feet in my rush to find shelter. I spotted an old carriage house, now silent and deserted. Without wasting a second, I ran and hid inside, behind the old walls. I listened, holding my breath, as the sound of the creature's wings faded into the night. When I dared to look out, I saw it disappear into the darkness. Once I was sure it was gone, I emerged from my hiding place, shaking and sweating. My legs felt like jelly, and my breaths were slowly returning to normal. The village was still and silent again, with barely any trace of the strange encounter. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying not to doubt my sanity. I got into my car, every part of me screaming to leave. But a strange reluctance gripped me as I looked at the mansion one last time. Disbelief and shock left me questioning the last half hour, but I couldn't deny it. I had seen something extraordinary. Now, as I write down my experience, I can't shake off the cold dread that lingers in my core. I'm not going to stop. I'm going back, maybe tomorrow, in the light of day. I'm not about to let fear stop me from exploring. After all, isn't this thrill what I came for? Only time will tell whether it was my intuition or just a trick of the mind. I had always wanted to write a novel. I dreamed of crafting a story that would captivate readers and leave them wanting more. So, I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods for a month. I thought the peace and quiet would help me focus. Little did I know, my time there would be far more thrilling than anything I could have imagined. The cabin was cozy, with a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. It was surrounded by thick trees and was miles away from the nearest town. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and spent the mornings writing. In the afternoons, I would take long walks in the woods, listening to the sounds of nature and letting my mind wander. One evening, after a particularly productive day, I decided to take a walk just as the sun was setting. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was cool and crisp. I wandered deeper into the forest than usual, feeling a strange sense of adventure. As I walked, I noticed the woods were eerily silent. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off and continued walking, but the silence began to weigh on me. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, standing tall and still. I laughed at myself for being so jumpy and kept walking, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. The sun had set, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. As I turned to go back, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. It was a figure, standing just behind a tree. My heart raced as I tried to make out what it was. The figure stepped out from behind the tree. It was tall and thin, with long, bony arms and legs. Its eyes were sunken and dark, and its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. It looked like something out of a nightmare. I stood frozen in place, unable to move. The creature stared at me with its hollow eyes, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I knew I had to get back to the cabin, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Finally, I managed to break free from my fear and ran as fast as I could back to the cabin. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting to safety. I burst through the cabin door and slammed it shut behind me. I locked the door and pushed a chair up against it, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there trying to catch my breath and listened for any signs of the creature outside. For what felt like hours, I stood by the door, listening. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling. Just silence. I finally dared to look out the window, but there was no sign of the creature. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fireplace, too afraid to go to bed. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep in the chair. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and a heavy heart. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I packed my things and left as quickly as I could. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Back in the safety of my own home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I did some research and discovered that the creature I had seen matched the description of a Wendigo, a mythical beast from Native American folklore. The Wendigo was said to be a spirit that could possess humans and turn them into cannibalistic monsters. I couldn't believe what I had experienced, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I decided to write about it, turning my terrifying encounter into a novel. The story practically wrote itself, and before long I had finished my book. My novel became a bestseller, and readers were captivated by the tale of the writer who encountered a Wendigo in the woods. Many people thought it was just a work of fiction, but I knew the truth. My time in the cabin had been real, and the fear I felt that night was something I would never forget. Looking back, I realized that my encounter with the Wendigo had given me the inspiration I needed to write my novel. It was a terrifying experience, but it also pushed me to create something amazing. And while I would never go back to that cabin, I was grateful for the story it had given me. Exploring the dense and mysterious Likuala swamp in the Republic of the Congo had always been a dream of mine. As a scientist, I had always been fascinated by the secrets that nature holds, especially in such a remote and untouched part of the world. I was here to collect samples of a unique plant species that grew in the swamp, but what I found was something much more extraordinary. The journey to the Likuala swamp was long and challenging. I traveled by plane, boat, and finally on foot through thick jungle terrain. The heat was oppressive, and the humidity made it hard to breathe. My guide, a local villager named Ngoko, was a quiet man who knew the swamp like the back of his hand. He moved through the dense foliage with ease while I struggled to keep up, swatting at the endless swarms of insects that seemed intent on making me their next meal. On the third day of our journey, we reached a small clearing near the edge of a wide, slow-moving river. The water was dark and murky, hiding whatever lay beneath its surface. This was where Ngoko said we would find the plant I was looking for. As I set up my equipment, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer wildness of the place. It felt like stepping back in time to an era when humans were not the dominant force on the planet. I spent the morning collecting samples, carefully cutting small pieces of leaves and stems and placing them into plastic bags for later analysis. The plant was unlike anything I had ever seen, with broad, waxy leaves and bright red flowers that seemed to pulse with life. I was so absorbed in my work that I almost didn't notice the strange feeling that had begun to creep over me. It was a sensation of being watched, of eyes upon me from the dense undergrowth. I glanced around nervously, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Ngoko was sitting nearby, staring intently at the river. He seemed on edge, which was unusual for him. I was about to ask him what was wrong when I saw it. At first, it was just a ripple in the water, a slight disturbance that could have been caused by a fish or a submerged log. But then the ripple grew larger, and I saw something break the surface. It was massive, easily the size of a car, with a long, sinuous neck that rose out of the water like a serpent. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, unable to believe what I was seeing. The creature's head was large and reptilian, with small, beady eyes that seemed to take in everything around it. Its body was mostly submerged, but I could see the outline of a huge, bulky shape just below the surface. It moved slowly, almost lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. I knew immediately what it was: Mokelembembe, the legendary cryptid that was said to inhabit these swamps. For years, stories of Mokelembembe had circulated among cryptozoologists and locals alike. Some described it as a living dinosaur, a relic from a prehistoric age. Others thought it was a myth, a creature born of imagination and fear. But here it was, in front of me, as real as the plants I had been studying. I stood frozen, torn between the instinct to flee and the desire to document this incredible sighting. My camera was in my bag, just a few feet away, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Ngoko, too, seemed transfixed by the creature. For a moment, we were both silent witnesses to a secret of the natural world that few had ever seen. The Mokalembembe moved closer to the shore, its head bobbing slightly as it surveyed its surroundings. I could see the muscles in its neck ripple beneath its scaly skin. It let out a low rumbling sound that resonated through the air, a noise unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Slowly, I reached for my camera, my hands shaking with excitement and fear. I managed to snap a few photos, but I knew they wouldn't capture the true majesty of what I was seeing. The creature seemed to sense my movement and turned its head in my direction. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I felt a connection to this ancient being, a link to a time long past. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Mokalembembe began to retreat. It sank back into the water, its massive form disappearing beneath the surface with barely a ripple. The swamp returned to its previous stillness, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a dream. Ngoko and I stood there for a long time, absorbing what we had just witnessed. Eventually, he broke the silence, speaking in a low, reverent tone. He told me that the local people had always respected the Mokalembembe, seeing it as a guardian of the swamp. They believed that it was a creature of great power and wisdom, one that should be left undisturbed. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the experience. I had come to the Likwala swamp to study plants, but I was leaving with a story that would stay with me forever. The sighting of Mokalembembe was a reminder of the mysteries that still exist in our world, and the importance of preserving the wild places where such wonders can be found. Back in my lab, as I analyzed the plant samples, I often thought of that day. The photographs I had taken were shared with colleagues and sparked much debate, but I knew that no image could truly convey the awe and wonder of seeing Mokalembembe in the flesh. It was an encounter that transcended science, a glimpse into a world that still holds secrets waiting to be discovered. My name is Tom, and I work at a drilling plant in the middle of the Gobi Desert. It's a tough job, but it's my job, and I do it with pride. We drill for oil and minerals, and it's often very hot and dusty. Most days are pretty ordinary, with nothing more exciting than a broken drill or a missed lunch break. But one day, something happened that I will never forget. It started like any other day. The sun was blazing down on us, and the desert stretched out endlessly in every direction. We were drilling in a new spot, trying to reach a layer of rock that we hoped would be rich in oil. I was working with my team, and we were busy with our drills and machinery. Around mid-afternoon, something strange caught my eye. It was just a glimpse at first, a flash of movement under the sand. I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe an animal scurrying by. But then it happened again, and this time it was clear that something large was moving beneath the surface. I called out to my supervisor, Jack. "Hey Jack, come over here. I think there's something strange going on." Jack came over and looked where I was pointing. We both saw it now, a rippling, undulating movement beneath the sand. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Jack frowned and said, "Let's dig a bit and see what's causing it." We used a smaller drill to dig down, careful not to cause too much disturbance. As the sand was pulled away, the movement grew more pronounced. My heart started to race as the ground began to tremble. Then, without warning, a massive, worm-like creature burst out from the sand. It was enormous, easily 20 feet long and as thick as a barrel. Its body was covered in thick, wrinkled, reddish-brown skin. It had no legs or visible eyes, but its mouth was a gaping, round hole filled with sharp, jagged teeth. The thing was like a monster from a nightmare. I stood frozen in shock as the creature wriggled and writhed. It made a strange, low, growling noise that sent shivers down my spine. Jack and I exchanged terrified glances. Neither of us had ever seen anything like this before, and we had no idea what to do. The worm seemed just as surprised to see us as we were to see it. It flailed around, its massive body slamming against the sides of the hole we had made. We had to act quickly. I grabbed the radio and called for an emergency evacuation. "This is Tom. We've got a giant creature here. We need to get out, now." The drilling plant was quickly evacuated, and soon the entire team was gathered at a safe distance. We watched in awe and fear as the creature continued to thrash around in the hole we had dug. It was clear that it was trying to escape, but the more it struggled, the deeper it seemed to sink into the ground. We tried to figure out what to do next. Some of the team members suggested calling in experts or using specialized equipment to deal with the creature. We decided to contact a wildlife research team from a nearby university. It was clear that this was not an ordinary animal, and we needed help. The research team arrived later that day, bringing with them all sorts of tools and equipment. They were excited but cautious. They took samples of the sand and soil around the creature and started analyzing it. They also set up cameras to observe the worm's behavior and make sure it didn't escape. As night fell, we could see the worm less clearly, but we could still hear its low growls and see the occasional flash of its wriggling body. The researchers worked late into the night, and by morning they had made some interesting discoveries. According to their findings, the creature was a Mongolian death worm, a legendary and mysterious beast said to live in the Gobi Desert. According to the legends, it was a fearsome creature with deadly powers. The researchers were thrilled to have found it and were eager to learn more about it. They carefully captured the worm and transported it to their research facility for further study. They promised to keep us updated on their findings. As for us, we returned to our drilling work, but things would never be quite the same. The legend of the Mongolian death worm became famous, and our drilling plant was in the news for weeks. We were both proud and relieved that we had discovered something so rare and significant. And as for me, I'll always remember that day in the desert when I saw the Mongolian death worm with my own eyes. It was a day that reminded me just how mysterious and surprising the world can be. About a year ago, I worked as a night tour guide at an old mansion in St. Louis, Missouri called the Lemp Mansion. This place was known for being haunted, and each tour seemed creepier than the last. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, guiding tours in a supposedly haunted house can mess with your mind. I used to look at the portraits of William and Elsa Lemp, who had passed away, and their serious expressions made the ghost stories feel even more real. The Lemp family was famous for their beer business in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but they had a lot of bad luck. People died under strange circumstances, and the mansion was full of eerie stories. The spooky tour was the last tour of the day, where we walked around the mansion at night. Even though I didn't believe in ghosts, it was my job to entertain the guests. That particular night started just like any other. I showed them the intricate woodwork in the entrance, the grand dining room where the Lemps held their parties, and the attic where they hid a son with a rare condition. As the guests moved on, I stayed behind in the attic, feeling something odd. It was unusually quiet. I glanced around and saw something strange, like a blur, at the edge of my vision. I was alone in the room. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the flickering lantern light. But my heart raced, and I hoped someone would find me soon. Eventually, I decided to check it out. The air grew cold as I approached the blurry shape. Then I saw a figure appear in the dim light. A woman dressed like she was from the 1940s. She looked ghostly and bright, and I felt a chill. I thought I heard a whisper, and then she vanished. Frozen and heart-pounding, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it or if it was something supernatural. I forced myself to return to the group, trying to act normal, but my mind was still in the attic with the ghostly woman. After the tour ended, I checked the attic window, but everything seemed normal. The mansion seemed different after that night. Instead of just a spooky place for tourists, it felt like an old home with a lot of history. Every corner and room seemed to hold stories of people who once lived there. Their laughter, tears, and whispers. Since that night, the tours felt more intense, and my guests noticed it too. The stories seemed more real, and the house felt alive with its past. I wasn't just telling the tales anymore. I felt like I was part of them. It changed everything.